My parents decided the best way to deal with their unemployed golden child was to plant him in my apartment without even running it by me. And since I was already renting their unit with no lease, they figured why not double the rent too? Apparently, I was now funding his lifestyle by default. When I pushed back, they shrugged and said, "That's your choice." Fine. My choice was to take every single thing I'd bought and leave the place looking like a display model after clearance day. But to understand why that mattered, you need to know what the apartment started as. Meet my apartment, aka The Trap. When I first stepped into that apartment my parents owned, it looked like four walls and punishment disguised as opportunity. No lease, no paperwork, just pay us rent and you can stay here. It sounded simple, but simplicity has a way of flipping into a trap. The place wasn't just unfurnished, it was hollow. No curtains, no chair, not even a forgotten lamp. It felt less like moving into a home and more like setting up camp inside a concrete shoebox. And yet, at 22, I started paying them rent every month. From that point on, everything inside those walls was going to come from me, or there wasn't going to be anything at all. That first night was spent with a blanket on the floor, staring at the ceiling and thinking this was rock bottom for comfort. Slowly, though, I chipped away at the emptiness. Piece by piece, with the money I earned from working full-time, I started stocking the place. A mattress on a basic frame, the kind that doesn't look like luxury, but still felt like progress. Later, a couch that held up under everyday use, not much to look at, but solid enough to show I live like an adult with furniture, rather than a student with beanbags. I saved again and bought a small dining table with 4 chairs, even though my guest list never reached 4. Shelves, a desk, kitchen basics like pans, knives, spatulas, all of them earned one paycheck at a time. I even upgraded to a TV, not massive, but clear enough to watch a film without feeling like I was squinting into a phone. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and that's what gave the space away. Each piece stood as a symbol that I wasn't leaning on handouts. I bought what I needed, sometimes what I wanted, and stacked the room with evidence that I was standing on my own. I knew the price of every spoon, every mug, because it came at the cost of skipped luxuries elsewhere. Nothing had been gifted, nothing handed down. No one else had taken part in transforming that echo chamber into an actual home. The longer I lived there, the more pride I attached to those purchases. I didn't care if it looked modest compared with impressive apartments full of designer furniture. For me, it meant progress. After long shifts, collapsing into a bed I paid for didn't feel like just rest. It felt like proof. Eating out of a bowl in my kitchen didn't feel mundane. It was a reminder that I'd bought each part of that meal setting with money I had earned. My parents, on the other hand, kept their role strictly transactional. They wanted the rent on time, but there was never an offer to lend a hand furnishing or repairing anything. A leaky faucet? My problem. Broken light? Mine. Even as they collected the money, they treated the apartment as just another unit they happened to own, detached completely from the fact that I was building something inside of it. That gap in perspective mattered. To my parents, it was extra square footage they controlled. To me, it became the stage where I proved to myself that I could handle independence. I wasn't waiting around for their scraps. I actually worked, managed, and planned. The living area became a collection of proof that I was the opposite of helpless. Still, inside the family, the apartment never earned recognition as mine. They dismissed it almost casually. If they noticed me bringing in something like an office chair to replace the floor-sitting setup I've been using, the comment would be flat, like, "Oh, you got a chair." No acknowledgement, no respect for the effort behind it. Looking back, I think that dismissal planted a problem I didn't see forming. I viewed the apartment as something personal because I had filled its emptiness myself, but they continued to see it as just theirs, a space they owned, no matter who was paying to make it livable. That difference in how we saw the same 4 walls was critical. I thought I had carved out a little independence, but to them it remained a flexible property they could rearrange whenever it was convenient. And that's the piece I missed at the time. Because while I was proud of owning every light bulb, every plate, every cushion, none of it shifted the way my family viewed the apartment. They weren't concerned with how much of myself I had already poured into the place. When they decided to shuffle pieces around on their side of the chessboard, they treated the apartment as something they could reassign, like I'd only ever been a placeholder tenant. So when they finally acted on that perspective, I didn't see it coming. The golden child enters stage left. Here's where the family production really took its turn. Enter my brother, mid-20s, unemployed for years, and forever described by my parents as being in a rough patch. That phrase became the family's magic wand, waved every time reality pointed out he hadn't worked a single steady job since finishing school. According to them, his downtime was temporary. According to a calendar, his downtime had already lasted longer than a college degree. The funny part is, he doesn't look miserable. He's not pacing the floor stressed about interviews or waking up early to hand out resumes. He's stretched across a couch, controller in hand, running marathon gaming sessions that he calls stress relief. I used to stop by my parents' place for dinner before he moved in with me. Without fail, there he'd be, sweatpants, headphones, a pile of wrappers within arm's reach. When I hinted that maybe he should spend 10 minutes filling out a job application, my parents would leap to his defense. They'd paint the picture of an overburdened soul who just needed time. He's been under a lot of pressure, they'd say, as if pressure meant choosing between switching the console off or starting another round. In their eyes, he wasn't avoiding responsibility. He was enduring some noble struggle. They compared him to an artist misunderstood by the times. If society just recognized his value, he'd succeed. Never mind the fact that his craft was consuming Wi-Fi bandwidth and frozen food. For years, his naps were reframed as recharging, his skipped chores as conserving energy, his lack of progress as waiting for the right fit. Evidently, the right fit doesn't exist anywhere in our city because it's been missing in action for nearly a decade. And then came the decision that flipped his lifestyle directly onto me. My parents, tired of crumbs on their counters, concluded that a better way to support him would be to send him into my apartment. Their wording wasn't up for discussion. They didn't ask if I was open to it. They told me he'd be moving in for a while, which in family speak translates to until further notice. Apparently, the logic was simple. I already had a place, I was already paying, and therefore I could carry both of us. That logic stripped me of choice at the very start. There was no negotiation, no trade-off, no recognition of the weight it would add to my life. Just a declaration disguised as family duty. And when I objected, the retort was immediate: family helps family. Except that phrase is never balanced in practice. I've been paying my parents' rent each month since I turned 22 without issue. My brother's contribution? 0. In our family math, my hard work equals responsibility while his inertia equals sympathy. Watching how differently we were treated was like holding up 2 receipts and realizing one is filled with line items and charges while the other is completely blank. I built stability for myself, paid them regularly, furnished an entire apartment piece by piece. He coasted year after year, rent-free, sheltered by parents who bailed him out at every missed turn. Yet somehow, I was assigned as the one offering him a helping hand, even when that help came at my own expense. What made it almost darkly funny was how the story was framed. My parents pitched the whole arrangement as if I was gaining a companion, reducing the stress on the family as a whole. To them, it was balance. 2 siblings under one roof, problem solved. From my side, it was more like a roommate who only knew how to consume space, food, and electricity without even pretending to pull his weight. The only bill he managed to rack up was in empty pizza boxes. Think about it in straight numbers. Rent stayed the same. Utilities stayed the same. Every grocery bag was still mine to drag home. The only new variable was another adult living there, one who satisfied none of the responsibilities but doubled nearly all of the costs. What my parents described as helping him translated in real life to me covering an entire second lifestyle. My parents thought they'd shifted the equation in a fair direction. In reality, they just blurred the lines of fairness until I was the one footing both halves. And this wasn't subtle favoritism anymore, it was choreographed. They excused his lack of work as a misfortune beyond his control while treating my financial stability as limitless. If I voiced concerns, the answer came with a mix of dismissal and guilt tripping. He needs support, you can provide it. End of discussion. His failure to contribute didn't register as a problem. My resistance to bankroll him did. From that moment, I became his sponsor by default. No contract, no acknowledgement, just an unspoken assignment. The tone in our household shifted. What used to be seen as parental assistance was now masked as sibling responsibility. The solution wasn't to hold him accountable. It was to keep him comfortable and pass the inconvenience to me. The sharpest part is how they justified it. They insisted this was only temporary, but I'd seen enough family temporaries expand before. My brother's unfinished chapters never came with end dates, only reruns. His rough patch had been scripted long before, and my apartment became the new stage for it. So when he arrived, lounging immediately like the living room had been waiting for him, the tone was set. The second bedroom that I'd set up as a guest space transformed overnight into his private den. His contribution was invisible. My parents acted like this arrangement finally put both kids on equal ground, but I was the only one still paying to stand there. There's a certain irony in all of it. The parents who insisted he needed structure decided not to give him any. They just handed him a softer landing. And the person who had already built their own structure, me, ended up shouldering the fallout. It was as if the furniture, food, and monthly bills weren't proof enough that I had my life in order. Instead, they became evidence that I could handle even more. The sitcom plot practically wrote itself. I was funding the production, furnishing the set, and carrying the co-star who added chaos without adding comedy. And somehow, my parents were satisfied with the script, convinced this was balance, fairness, or maybe even discipline. But living it out daily was different. Once he settled in, the ease with which he slipped into old habits told me exactly what the next chapter was going to look like. Daily life with Captain Couch. Daily life with Captain Couch set a new standard for imbalance I hadn't thought possible. While I woke up at 6, battled through office hours, and carried groceries home, his daily commitment was staking a claim on the couch and rarely budging from it. Unemployed or not, he treated it like the control center for his existence. Blankets piled on one side, controllers on the other, and wrappers scattered everywhere in between. It became his throne, his refueling station, and apparently, his bed. His move-in was laughably minimal. He arrived with one basket of wrinkled clothes, a beat-up backpack, and absolutely no household contribution. Not a chair, not a lamp, not even a pillow. He looked around, nodded at the couch I'd worked 2 paychecks for, and acted like it had been waiting all this time just to serve him. That was his entire move-in process. No setup, no effort, just instant annexation of my living room. Day after day, I'd come back from work to find the evidence of his hardship lifestyle spread across every surface. The dishes would still be in the sink, most of them mine, but used by him, and the counters littered with crumbs and cans. His laundry formed its own mountain on the bedroom floor. If I asked for help, even something as small as take out the trash, it was met with theatrical resistance. The smallest task became a lecture on how I didn't understand what he was going through. Once, I told him he had to clean up after demolishing half the kitchen in one sitting, and instead of lifting a sponge, he called our mom. 10 minutes later, I was getting a text from her saying I should cut him some slack. Slack? I was drowning in chores that weren't even mine. Groceries were the most predictable disaster. I'd spend time and money stocking the fridge, sometimes planning meals out for a week. But no matter how carefully I budgeted, the food would vanish within 48 hours. Frozen pizzas, cereal, anything snackable, it was all gone before I had a chance to eat once. More infuriating was his defense. He claimed he ate so much because comfort food helped him through this rough time. Apparently, my working hours and bills weren't worthy of comfort, just his never-ending rest period. Then there were the nights. While I tried to claw back a few hours of sleep before the next workday, my apartment echoed with gunfire from his games or laugh tracks from endless reruns. Midnight would roll around and the volume never dipped, no matter how many times I asked. He looked at me like I was unreasonably fragile for not appreciating his need to relax. Relax? What exactly was he recovering from? Sitting too hard? Bathrooms weren't spared either. Towels sprawled across floors, empty bottles balanced on the tub, and streaks of beard trimmings left like a breadcrumb trail in the sink. If I stocked toilet paper, it vanished without being replaced. Same excuse every time. I forgot. Funny, he never forgot to cue the next episode in his sitcom marathons. The role assignments in our apartment were clear. I was the provider, cleaner, cook, and errand runner. His role was consuming, lounging, and defending his position as the couch contender of the year. The sheer audacity of how comfortable he became was jarring. For him, this wasn't freeloading, it was just life operating at its natural pace. There was no embarrassment, no guilt, only entitlement. At first, I kept thinking the situation was ridiculous enough to laugh at. But the humor wore down fast. Every wrapper I picked up, every load of dishes I washed, and every late-night video game rant coming through the wall chipped away at patience I didn't have to spare. And the worst part? He painted himself as the victim whenever anyone questioned him. Living with Captain Couch started to twist into a lesson about unspoken family rules. He could eat my food and bury the place in mess, and if I resisted, somehow I was the one out of line. The parents who'd placed him in my space didn't see the imbalance because whenever tension boiled over, they chose his comfort over my complaints. By that point, my resentment wasn't even rooted in the chores. It was the normalization of unfairness. I worked, paid, cooked, and maintained. He consumed, blamed, avoided, and called in parental reinforcement when pressed. It was one-sided on every front. And when no one else even acknowledged that fact, it became clear I was the only one carrying the weight of our so-called arrangement. That was the daily cycle, one of us working to move forward, the other glued to the couch while being shielded from accountability. And as uneven as it felt, no one in the family seemed surprised or bothered, except me. It was misery wrapped in repetition. The days piled on and the imbalance didn't shrink, it cemented. And then, out of nowhere, my dad decided to raise the stakes, because apparently constant freeloading wasn't enough on its own. So when the phone rang, and he mentioned changing the rent, it felt like the finale I'd been bracing for. The parents proposed a comedy scam. It started with what my parents called a chat about the apartment, a word that should have signaled something casual, but their expressions made it clear this wasn't small talk. They sat me down and delivered the news with a kind of practiced calm, almost as if they'd rehearsed it. The message was simple. Since there were now 2 adults living in the apartment, the rent was going to be adjusted. And by adjusted, they meant doubled, starting next month. The reasoning they offered was just as blunt. My dad said, someone has to pay, and your brother's in no position right now. That was their logic, boiled down into one sentence. My brother had moved in. He wasn't paying. And instead of pressing him to contribute, their solution was to double my rent and make me responsible for carrying both of us. I sat there stunned, less by the increase itself than by how confidently they framed it as fair. According to them, 2 adults in one apartment meant more value being used, which meant more money owed. But only I was the one meant to shoulder it. In any ordinary setup, rent would be split or at least adjusted so both parties contributed. Here, my parents treated the entire situation like it was obvious. I was working, he was not, and therefore I should cover his share without complaint. The kicker was financial practicality. Up until then, the rent I paid was slightly under the market rate for similar units in the area, which made sense because it was a family arrangement and the place had started completely bare. But doubling it didn't just balance things out, it shoved the price above market value. In other words, I'd be paying more than strangers paid for better equipped apartments, all while funding a sibling who added nothing but noise, crumbs, and demands for Wi-Fi speed. The delivery itself almost felt like a parody of a business pitch. They leaned into words like fair and reasonable as though repetition would make it true. It reminded me of getting signed up for a premium subscription I hadn't asked for, except instead of new features and benefits, the upgraded plan came with extra dishes, missing groceries, and a permanent dent in the couch cushions from my brother's naps. They made it sound like I was lucky to be chosen for this role, when, in reality, it was just another drain. What struck me most wasn't only the demand, but the assumption I'd accept it. They didn't phrase it as a request. There was no sense of negotiation or even acknowledgement that they were asking me to take on something unreasonable. The tone suggested this was already decided, that all I had to do was nod and continue funding the new version of the apartment life, now with bonus freeloader included. That level of entitlement, wrapped in calm certainty, made me question for a split second whether I was the one being unreasonable by even pushing back. But I knew better. I replayed the situation in my head like simple math. I was already paying every bill on time. I was already covering food for 2 people. And now, instead of splitting, my parents wanted me to double my rent so their youngest child didn't have to grow up. The absurdity wasn't hidden. It was right on the surface. Their version of fairness meant turning me into a safety net on both ends, financially and logistically, with no regard for how unbalanced it was in practice. Hearing them lay it out so plainly was almost comical. It was like watching someone explain a pyramid scheme, but insisting it was community support. They positioned themselves at the top, congratulating themselves for solving a problem, while in reality, the entire structure balanced on me paying double. My brother occupied the middle without effort, collecting free room and board as if he'd earned it. And me? I was the base, working harder, draining more, but somehow expected to believe this was an upgrade for everyone involved. If you strip away the absurd framing, the situation was straightforward. My parents had chosen to protect one son's comfort by doubling down on the other's responsibility. They could have asked him to step up, or at least contribute something symbolic to show effort. Instead, they shielded him completely and pressed me to carry the burden alone. It wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was favoritism disguised as moral logic. The more they talked, the more obvious the disconnect became. They described this arrangement like it was balanced, like both children were being treated fairly. But balance doesn't mean taking everything from one and giving everything to the other. Balance means both sides carry weight. What they were proposing wasn't equalization, it was exploitation dressed up as duty. By the time they finished, I wasn't shocked so much as resigned. Their priorities had been clear for years, but hearing them spell out that doubling my rent was the fair solution made it undeniable. I knew there was no way I could justify staying. The numbers didn't add up, financially or emotionally. Paying that much rent, above market, for the privilege of supporting someone else's inertia wasn't sustainable. It didn't make sense on paper, and it didn't make sense in principle. And that's when the decision started to settle in. I realized this wasn't just about 1 month's bill, or even the next. This was a line in the sand about what my role in the family was supposed to be. They viewed me as the dependable one who could be squeezed for more, and him as the fragile one who needed shelter from real accountability. Left unchecked, that pattern wasn't going to stop here. Rent doubling today meant another demand tomorrow, and maybe another one after that, all justified by the same warped version of fairness. I didn't argue further in that moment because there was nothing left to say. I understood their position, and they had made it clear they weren't budging. My only option was to accept or walk away. For them, doubling their responsible child's rent was common sense. For me, it was the breaking point, and that breaking point made me realize something important. Every conversation eventually reaches a moment where their justifications run out, and your choice becomes painfully clear. This was mine. When I told my parents I wasn't going along with the rent scam, they fired back with the coldest line in the family's entire playbook. If you don't like it, move out. No hesitation. No discussion. Just flat, casual dismissal, like they were cutting off a telemarketer. Years of paying them rent on time, furnishing the entire apartment out of my own pocket, carrying both myself and my freeloading brother, and that was their response. It wasn't said with concern or even negotiation. It was just sharp and final, as if my effort, my complaints, and my role didn't matter in the slightest. And here's the part that really stuck. They said it as though it was supposed to shut me down. Like tossing out a simple ultimatum would make me retreat, swallow the frustration, and go back to financing my brother's endless rough patch. They'd used guilt my whole life to keep me compliant. Family loyalty speeches, pity for my brother, rehearsed guilt trips designed to pull me back into line. But this time, there wasn't even that. just the bluntest version of too bad. They thought a short phrase would solve everything, but all it did was flip the switch in my head. Instead of making me back down, it stripped away any illusion that this setup was ever going to be fair. They weren't going to ask my brother to step up, and they definitely weren't ever going to take the pressure off me. Their loyalty wasn't split between us. It was firmly planted on his side. The funny thing is, I don't think they realized how powerful those 3 words were. That's your choice. Think about it. For years, they'd acted as if I didn't have a choice. Every time they leaned on me, I was expected to comply. Every time they excused his failures, I had to cover the gap. And then suddenly, without realizing it, they handed me the one tool that changed everything: permission to say no. They framed it like a dare, but what they really gave me was freedom. Did they think I'd stay anyway? Did they think I'd just keep paying double and cleaning up after my brother, grateful I still had a roof over my head? Hence what made it so bizarre. Their confidence was built on the assumption that I'd never walk away. They thought I was locked into the role permanently, the dependable child who'd been forever. But they miscalculated. That phrase didn't scare me. It clarified things. The second those words landed, it was obvious. If I stayed, nothing would change. If I left, at least I'd stop being their built-in safety net. They wanted me to believe moving out was unthinkable. But moving out was more thinkable than ever before. They thought they were calling my bluff. But I wasn't bluffing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just understood what they had handed me, almost accidentally. They thought that's your choice was the final word. For me, it was only the beginning. The moment they said it, the entire situation shifted. And what happens when someone like me does take that choice? When the responsible one? The quiet one? The one who always pays and fixes and carries? When that person decides they're done? That was the question running through my head on repeat. They didn't realize the weight of what they'd said. For them, it was just a throwaway line meant to put me back in my place. For me, it was the ignition moment. Walking out suddenly became not only possible, but necessary. And once I saw that, the plan practically wrote itself. Because if I was going to leave, I wasn't about to do it quietly. Everything I had bought, everything I had worked for: the couch, the table, the TV, the shelves, the lamp, even the shower curtain, it was mine. And when they gave me the choice, they gave me the opening to take it all. So yes, their big ultimatum landed exactly as they wanted. It ended the conversation. But it didn't end the way they imagined. It ended their control, their assumption that I'd always carry the load, and their belief that I'd never break character. They handed me the authority to walk, and I started planning immediately. What they thought was a dismissal became clarity. And what they thought was the end of the discussion? It was only the start of something much pettier. The petty plan of furniture liberation. The next step was obvious. If I was moving out, I wasn't leaving anything behind. Every chair, every plate, every lamp, I'd paid for all of it. So I decided the move wouldn't just be about relocating myself. It would be about reclaiming every single thing I'd put into that apartment. In my head, it became the petty plan of furniture liberation. Not a dramatic showdown, not a screaming exit, just a clean sweep of everything I owned, leaving only the echo of what I'd built. The first part of that plan was inventory. One night, while my brother was passed out on the couch, controller slipping out of his hand, I walked through each room quietly like I was conducting a survey. Bed? Mine. Couch? Definitely mine. Desk? Chair? Shelves? All mine. Kitchenware, utensils, toaster, microwave. Even the dented frying pan I'd burned once, also mine. I listed them silently, checking these things off in my head like evidence tags at a crime scene. The truth was overwhelming. If I didn't take these things, he'd be living in the comfort I had worked to provide. And that wasn't happening. Once I knew exactly what needed to go, the next step was to figure out how. I called a few close friends, explained the situation in simple terms. I was moving out, and I wasn't leaving a toothbrush behind. Their reactions were instant. Everyone had heard about my brother's freeloading, so the idea of dismantling his cushy setup sounded like poetic justice. It wasn't hard to find volunteers. By the end of the week, I had a full crew ready to help, each one promising to carry boxes with a grin just to watch his world collapse. Timing became the crucial detail. I remembered that most weekends, my brother disappeared for a stretch of hours to hang out with friends. That pattern made perfect cover. Moving out while he was gone meant no confrontation, no dramatic shouting match while furniture was disappearing around him. It would just be quiet, efficient, and absolute. So I set the plan for early Saturday morning, right after he left. By the time he came back, there wouldn't be anything more to argue about. With the timing locked, the van was next. Signing the rental agreement felt almost symbolic, like I was getting the keys not to a truck, but to freedom from years of imbalance. The clerk probably assumed I was doing a normal relocation. Meanwhile, I was arranging the equivalent of a furniture jailbreak, all of it above board, but executed with the precision of a mission. Supplies were gathered too, boxes, tape, blankets, every detail lined up so we could move quickly and thoroughly when the day came. When Saturday arrived, everything unfolded with a strange calm. My friends showed up early, smiling like they were about to film the finale of a sitcom. We started with the big items. The couch went first, the same couch my brother had turned into his permanent base. Carrying it through the doorway felt like reclaiming oxygen that had been vacuumed out of my space. Next was the bed I'd bought years earlier. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and dismantling it was strangely satisfying. Every piece that came apart was another reminder this comfort didn't belong to him. We worked room by room. Lamps unplugged, bulbs carefully boxed. Microwave and toaster slid into cartons. Dishes, cups, and forks clinked their way into other boxes. It wasn't about leaving him inconvenienced. It was about taking back what I'd worked for. Some of my friends laughed at the thoroughness. Even the shower curtain? Yes, even that. Small details mattered. The whole point was to ensure nothing I bought became part of his free ride. The kitchen filled box by box until it was bare. Plates vanished, drawers emptied, pots wrapped and stacked. One friend cracked up when I packed the salt shaker, but it made perfect sense. All of these things added up to a livable space, and none of them were his doing. My brother had treated those comforts like they just existed. He was about to learn that they only existed because I put them there. The living room cleared out quickly, too. Shelves emptied, TV disconnected, rug rolled tight. Soon the space echoed in a way I hadn't heard since the first day I'd moved in, before anything belonged to me. The emptiness was almost surreal. It wasn't destruction, it was subtraction, stripping away years of effort and leaving only walls my brother had never lifted a finger to furnish. As we carried out the last smaller items, trash cans, bath mat, plunger, the humor peaked. Friends kept tossing out one-liners. You leaving him the light bulbs at least? We laughed, but I stayed firm. If I'd paid for it, it went. Nobody could argue the logic. The more the van filled, the lighter I felt, not because I was unloading responsibility, but because I was taking full ownership of what I had built. By mid-afternoon, we were done. The apartment had transformed from home to hollow shell. The walls bounced sound like an empty warehouse. The kitchen was an echo of countertops, and the only thing left on the floor were faint imprints where furniture had once stood. Standing there with my friends, I realized just how much of myself I'd poured into that space, and how obvious it became when I took it all away. Without me, it wasn't a home. It was just an empty property. And that was the power of the plan. It wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, it was exact and undeniable. I didn't have to argue with my parents or fight my brother about what I was owed. I just packed it, carried it out, and drove away with it. The emptiness I left behind didn't need an explanation. It spoke for itself. As we closed the van doors and stood outside, sweaty and tired, I looked up at the windows one last time. Inside was no longer my problem. My part was finished. The so-called comforts my brother had lounged in every day were gone because they had never belonged to him in the first place. The funny part? He still had no idea any of this was happening. He walked out that morning expecting the apartment to stay exactly how it had always been. Later, he would return expecting the same comforts waiting for him. What he walked into instead changed the story entirely. Brother's shock of the century. My brother came through the door later that day, certain he was stepping back into the same routine he'd lived hundreds of times before. He pushed it open casually, bag slung over his shoulder, probably preloading the thought of collapsing onto his couch with a controller in hand. But as he crossed the threshold, nothing greeted him but emptiness. Hardwood floors stared up at him. Bare walls bounced his own movement back as echoes. The throne he'd spent months guarding, a couch he called bed, desk, and dining hall, was gone without a trace. For a few still seconds he didn't move, standing in blank silence while scanning the space like his brain was buffering. Then the panic hit. The first sign came through my phone. A text lit up the screen so fast it looked like it had tripped an alarm. WTF? Did you seriously take everything? That one message summed it all. He wasn't shocked that I'd left. He was stunned at what leaving actually looked like. The calm moment cracked open into chaos. Messages stacked one after another, tumbling in too rapidly to read in real time. Each one grew louder on the screen, like he was typing through clenched teeth. Demands to know where this stuff was. Dramatic declarations about being sabotaged. Accusations that I'd made the apartment unlivable. His drama peaked at a text that still makes me laugh. I'm sleeping on the floor. Do you even care? That was his headline complaint. Floor sleeping. Not months of unpaid living. Not the groceries he never bought. Not the rent he never paid. But the horror of no longer having a couch for endless gaming marathons. The texts escalated into calls minutes later. My screen buzzed through a string of missed calls in rapid succession, filling up with notifications like an emergency broadcast system. Every time I ignored one, a new voicemail dropped into the inbox. Later, when I listened, the pattern was almost comedic in its swings. Early voicemails brimmed with outrage, full of indignant disbelief that someone could strip a place bare. A few hours later, the tone shifted into desperation, his voice sagging into whines, insisting you didn't have to take all of it. When the night grew deeper and calls still went unanswered, the begging emerged. Please for me to at least bring the couch back, because apparently life without it was unbearable. I never answered. The silence was on purpose. Every call I ignored left him pacing in an empty living room with nothing but echoes. Every text without a reply stripped away the last bit of power from his tantrum. He was trying to argue with me, but really he was arguing with walls. He wanted me to explain, to defend, to wade back into another cycle of guilt and lectures, but I wasn't offering him that stage anymore. For the first time, his performance had no audience. And what revealed itself through his meltdown was the truth of his entitlement. In his mind, I wasn't just supposed to cover bills while he lounged rent-free. I was supposed to leave him all the comforts, too, as if every item of furniture had his name engraved. To him, the couch wasn't just a couch. It was a right. The bed wasn't just a bed. It was proof his lifestyle would still be carried no matter what choices he made. Even the dishes, the lamp, the shower curtain, all of it was supposed to remain donated automatically like part of his inheritance. But what he faced instead was bare reality. Hardwood in place of cushions. Cabinets with nothing waiting. A bathroom so stripped of detail it probably felt like a hotel room post-checkout. For the first time in years, he had to stand on his own 2 feet without a scaffold holding him up. And instead of reacting with shame or determination, he reacted with disbelief and panic. Because in his world, the safety net wasn't supposed to move. That's what made his so-called shock the centerpiece of this entire saga. Not just that the furniture left when I did, but that he never imagined it could. To him, my effort, my paycheck, my years of keeping the apartment running, it was all background noise, automatic, invisible work he assumed would never shift. The apartment had always been full when he came home, so of course it would remain that way forever. Until it didn't. His stunned reaction stretched throughout that night, yet nothing changed. Dozens of calls rang out unanswered. Dozens of texts piled unread on my phone. The reality didn't budge. I was gone, and the furniture was gone with me because it was mine. His tantrum didn't. Reconstruct the space, and my refusal to respond left him drowning in his own noise without anyone pulling him back up. That silence wasn't neglect. It was deliberate closure. And here's why that silence mattered most. He had always relied on other people filling the quiet for him. Parents rushing to defend, me stepping in to clean, someone providing excuses when none made sense. But this time, nothing came to soften the landing. Just hardwood floors he now had to sleep on. His meltdown had no resolution, no savior. It was exactly what his choices and inaction had earned. By the next morning, he was still raging into the void, sending message after message that blurred together insults, guilt trips, bargaining, desperation. But every notification rang against the same unchanged fact. The apartment was stripped. I wasn't coming back, and silence was my final word. He thought losing free rent was bad. He hadn't considered losing all the comforts along with it. And that vacuum of comfort didn't just shake him, it triggered the next ripple. Because once his performance failed to win me over, he reached for the next predictable step, calling in backup. And in our family, backup always meant one thing: our parents stepping onto the stage. Parents outrage, furniture edition. The calls from my parents began soon after, voices sharp with anger that didn't feel aimed where it belonged. They weren't outraged that my brother had freeloaded for months, or that he'd spent years refusing to stand on his own. No, their fury landed squarely on me. According to them, I'd left him with nothing, as if walking out with the furniture I bought was some kind of heist, as if every chair, every plate, every lamp hadn't come from my paycheck in the first place. They accused me of cruelty. My mom sobbed through the phone, saying I'd been too harsh and that watching him sleep on the floor was breaking her heart. My dad chimed in with the word immature, telling me my exit had been childish, like I'd staged a prank rather than moved responsibly with what belonged to me. Both of them circled the same point. Yes, I had the option to move out, but not this way. Not by stripping the apartment bare. Not by making their golden child face 4 walls without cushions. That line, "You can move, but not like that," played like a bad punchline. They leaned into guilt, weaving monologues about family loyalty, about sticking together in hard times. My dad said I should have shown compassion. My mom, between tears, told me I should have at least left him the essentials. But her definition of essentials seemed to cover everything from a couch to cutlery. No one asked why he couldn't buy his own. No one wondered aloud why a grown man in his mid-20s needed another adult to subsidize his bed. The conversation skipped right past his responsibilities and stuck on mine. I reminded them of the facts. Every object had been paid for by me, right down to the smallest fork. They brushed it aside. "You wouldn't have had that place without us," my dad snapped, as though ownership of the building meant they also owned every paycheck I had funneled into it. To them, my labor and my money didn't build a home. They built a storage unit meant to be harvested for their preferred son when the time came. The logic bent and collapsed in on itself, but somehow it seemed airtight to them. When tears and guilt didn't crack me, they pivoted back to the family mantra: family helps family. They must have said those 3 words a dozen times, like repeating the phrase would turn it into a contract. But help had never moved both directions. It never meant my brother stepping up for me, never meant them backing me when I struggled, never meant any kind of reciprocity. No, the phrase existed only to funnel my resources toward one person. For them, the rule was simple. When he needed comfort, I owed it to him. I listened until the points began looping. Guilt, compassion, family unity, my immaturity. The pattern didn't shift. I could have predicted each turn before they spoke it. And with every repetition, my certainty only deepened. They hadn't made a case about fairness. They'd made one about entitlement. My brother's comfort mattered more than anything, even if buying him that comfort meant taking mine away. What struck me most was how little they seemed to realize about their own contradictions. They had told me explicitly that I had the choice to leave. They wanted me to think that's your choice meant submission or silence, but I'd taken it at face value. When I acted on it, when I stood up and followed through, Their outrage revealed what it had always meant. I only had choices that kept their system intact. Anything outside those boundaries became defiance. I could feel myself hardening as the conversation dragged on. Their accusations washed over me in waves: selfish, ungrateful, inconsiderate. At any other point in my life, all the guilt woven through those words might have pierced deeper. But not this time. Not after covering rent for both of us, after carrying an apartment on my back for years, after being told to double my rent while my brother played permanent victim. This time, their words didn't stick. There was a moment when my mom's voice cracked again, pleading that I put myself in his shoes. That line froze me with its absurdity. Put myself in his shoes? His shoes were lying in an unearned bed, eating food he didn't buy, and handing bills to someone else. If I put myself in those shoes, I wouldn't have furniture either, because I would have never lifted a finger to earn it. It snapped something clean in my head, and I realized then we weren't even speaking the same language. By the end, I stopped defending myself. I didn't explain again how each item had been mine. I didn't remind them of my years of rent. I didn't argue about the phrase, family helps family. I let them talk until their points started to blur into one another, and then I disengaged. Not with a dramatic declaration, not with yelling, but with the simplest move. I stopped answering. Calls, texts, voicemails, I left them all unopened. Going silent wasn't spite. It was necessity. Because I realized, sitting with the phone buzzing in my hand, that engaging only pulled me back into the same loop that had defined this family for years. Me carrying more weight, them insisting it was fair, and my brother floating freely through the middle. Silence was the only way to end the loop, so I cut the cord. No more explanations, no more defending. Whatever narrative they built among themselves didn't include me anymore. My brother could send messages, and my parents could spin outrage into full speeches, but none of it would land because the line was closed. For the first time in years, their cycle continued without my participation. And it was in that quiet, with their calls unanswered, that the strangest feeling set in. Peace, not dramatic, not euphoric, just a steady calm that came from refusing to carry their burden anymore. The snapshots of empty furnitureless rooms at the old place were no longer my concern. My brother could sleep on hardwood, my parents could cry over it, but none of that lived in my head anymore. That was the real shift. The point where their accusations turned from weapons into background noise. Nothing changed on their end. They were still angry, still convinced I should have left behind couches and cutlery, but everything changed on mine. I had drawn a line, locked the door, and for once, it stayed locked. And that quiet, that steady removal from the whole circus set the tone for what came next. Because once the last call went unanswered and the last word fell flat, I was finally able to step into a very different space. No contact and pure peace. When I set down the last box in my new apartment, I just stood there for a moment, taking in the silence. No buzzing phone lighting up with missed calls, no parents on speaker reminding me to be patient, no brother groaning from the couch about running out of snacks, just stillness. At first, it felt almost wrong, like my brain was bracing for the background noise I had lived with for years. But within minutes, the quiet settled over me in a way that didn't feel empty at all. It felt like oxygen. The calls did come, of course. My family tried everything, the missed calls piling up, voicemails multiplying one after another. But blocking them was instant. The second I hit that button, all the buzzing stopped. And instead of guilt, I felt relief. My phone finally stayed calm, and for once, I didn't need to defend myself or explain decisions to people who had never listened. The line to that old dynamic had been cut, and what replaced it was peace I hadn't known in years. The apartment itself wasn't fancy. Rent was slightly higher than before, but it was within my budget, and more importantly, my money went only toward my own living. No more covering the cost of two people on one paycheck. Walking inside, I didn't see high ceilings or luxury furniture, but I saw something better for walls that were mine, filled with furniture I had bought, food I had paid for, and a space I lived in without interference. That felt priceless. The kitchen became one of my favorite parts of the day. I could open the fridge midweek and actually find what I had stocked days earlier. The carton of eggs, still there. The juice bottle, still sealed, not emptied, and quietly replaced to hide the evidence. That predictability gave every small meal a sense of victory. Cooking on clean counters, setting a plate down without clearing crumbs, not dramatic changes, but deeply satisfying ones. The couch told the same story. After long shifts, sitting down in the exact spot I left for myself was its own kind of comfort. The cushions kept their shape because no one had spent 12 hours sunken into them. My throw pillows stayed propped instead of being buried under chip bags. Even the small detail of finding the remote on the coffee table every time mattered. For the first time, the living room looked and stayed how I wanted it. That ordinary sense of control was better than anything money could buy. Mornings were the proof of how different life had become. I walked into the kitchen without bracing myself for stacks of dirty dishes or half-cleaned pans. The space stayed as I left it. That consistency made even the most routine start of the day feel light, like I wasn't heading into battle before work. It felt like proof that peace wasn't about grand changes. It was about the absence of chaos. The bathroom, too, reflected the difference. My towel stayed dry on the rack where I had left it. The shower shelf held bottles that were full and functional, not a graveyard of empties leaned together in a corner. Even something as simple as a stocked roll of toilet paper was a reminder. Now I was the only one responsible, which meant it was always handled. These were tiny details, but each one was a quiet confirmation that I had taken the right step. Beyond the physical space came the absence of voices, the ones that used to follow me through every interaction. No guilt-inducing calls reminding me to be patient with my brother. No late-night monologues about family duty when I was already paying the bills. No sudden defenses of his laziness while ignoring the weight I was carrying. The script had stopped because I wasn't part of it anymore. For the first time, the only voice shaping my days was mine. The shift wasn't only emotional, it was financial too. Though the rent was marginally higher than the family unit, it felt like an upgrade. This new space didn't demand that I cover for another adult. Groceries no longer vanished within 48 hours. Utilities no longer spiked because games ran late into the night. Even accounting for the higher rent, I saved money simply by living on my own terms. Having my paycheck serve only me turned into a quiet freedom, a sense that my effort finally matched my reward. The peace grew clearer at night. Lying down in my own bed without hearing background TV noise or late-night laughter made sleep easier than before. The quiet wasn't eerie, it was liberating. For the first time, I didn't fall asleep calculating what had been eaten, broken, or wasted that day. I could close my eyes without tension in my shoulders, because I knew everything in that space stayed exactly as I had left it. Nights became steady in a way I didn't realize I'd been craving until I had them. Sometimes I thought back to what the old apartment must have looked like after I emptied it. Bare hardwood floors, empty cupboards, no couch to collapse on, no TV waiting. That image always brought me a satisfaction that felt clean, not guilty. The emptiness reflected my brother's contribution. It showed him, and my parents by extension, what the space truly looked like without me propping it up. For years, I had filled those walls with my effort while they acted as if it had no value. Now, they could see what my absence really meant. The biggest change wasn't something physical, it was the absence of weight. That knot in my stomach that tightened every time my brother reached for food I paid for was gone. That rolling frustration when my parents called to chide me about compassion had vanished. Each day in my new apartment, the heaviness thinned out until it wasn't part of my routine anymore. In its place was lightness, clean rooms, intact food, unbroken rest. I realized quickly that pure peace doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't look like milestones or celebrations. It looks like towels that stay dry on the rack, like food that lasts for the week you planned, like waking up to a home the way you left it. It's not dramatic. It's steady. And in that steadiness, I found freedom. Over time, it became less about the revenge and more about the reset. Taking my furniture had been the sharp punctuation mark at the end of an old chapter. But what mattered was what came after, a space that matched my effort and respected my boundaries. Liberation wasn't a one-time explosion. It was every single morning I woke up and realized there was no one draining the life out of my home. That constancy, more than any outburst or fight, was what restored me. Leaving wasn't just about shutting a door behind me. It was about choosing to live without imbalance, to cut ties with conversations that would never change, to finally give the work I put in back to myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't performing for my family script. I was living in mine. That clarity, paired with the silence, rebuilt me in ways I didn't expect. Living alone, I didn't just reclaim furniture, I reclaimed dignity. I reclaimed the belief that my work had value and that I didn't owe it to anyone who refused to respect it. Peace wasn't a luxury. It was the baseline I should have had all along. Even now, when I glance around my apartment and everything is in its place, there's a quiet laugh underneath it. The comedy isn't in the chaos anymore. It's in how wonderfully ordinary life can be when it's yours. And sometimes, that's the sharpest punchline. Have you ever had to reclaim your stuff just to prove a point? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to read them. Because as I learned, peace doesn't come from keeping the balance for everyone else. It comes from taking back what was always yours. And that truth set up the final realization of this entire story. Revenge doesn't always need to be elaborate. Sometimes, the simplest and funniest move is reclaiming exactly what you paid for. One chair, one lamp, one spatula at a time. Watching my brother stand in an empty apartment proved how quickly entitlement crumbles when no one else is holding it up. That was the real lesson. Independence isn't just freedom. It's removing yourself from a setup that only worked at your expense. Now I want to hear from you. Drop your own freeloading family stories in the comments, hit like if this petty payback made you smile, and subscribe for more.